So recently, I was looking up some things on Fuefuki, the real-life Japanese city Persona 4's Inaba is inspired by, and something just hit me. The reality of Inaba's shopping district and future is even more tragic than it appears at first glance. I mean, it's not like Persona 4 shied away from the Junez reality and the conflict that comes out of that anyway. But even then, the real life context of early 2000s Japan just takes it to a whole new level, and this is due to the pressing topic at the time referred to as Genkai Shuuraku. But before I really dive into what that is, I'd like to set the stage a bit more and draw your attention to the party members' personas, as well as the deities we fight in the final months of the game. These figures really drive home the idea that Persona 4 is deeply entrenched in traditional Japanese beliefs, culture, and customs, especially as they pertain to the indigenous Shinto creation myths in particular. Shinto is considered a nature religion, and one of the major conflicts in Inaba involves the inevitable modernization of the rural town, which forces a confrontation between the old Japanese way of life and the new concepts of an increasingly globalized era, as symbolized by something like Junez. And an interview with director Hashino emphasizes this when it confirmed Atlas's intent on creating a rural and traditionally Japanese setting to contrast the urban setting of Persona 3. So when it comes to Inaba, its real-life town of Fuefuki has an interesting history of how it came to be, and this is a thing I just recently learned. Fuefuki is a merger between 6 localities back in 2004, 5 towns and a single village, which in and of itself is a reflection of this thing called the Great Heisei Consolidation, a massive number of town mergers that occurred from 1999 to about 2006. But before we really dive into the details of it, first, there's some other context to cover on why these mergers were necessary in the first place. Genkai Shuuraku was a major topic of discussion during the turn of the century in Japan. Shuuraku means village, and Genkai generally means marginal or limit, so all these characters together can be understood as limit of the village. This described the rural areas in Japan that were facing a demographic crisis where over 50% of the town was 65 or older. Okay, to be fair, as of 2020, Fuefuki's 65 plus population is a little above 30%, which makes me curious about what all the different towns' populations were like individually before everybody merged, but unfortunately, I haven't been able to find that information. Anyway, there are many accumulating factors over the decades prior that contribute to the reality of Genkai Shuuraku, but for brevity's sake, a major one of the late 90s/early 2000s was the continuing struggle of the Japanese economy since the initial asset bubble pop about a decade prior. It's what led to what was once called the Lost Decade, though as of now in the 2020s, it's become more like the Lost Decades, plural, though that's beside the point. Anyway, it's something you've probably heard me talk about before if you're familiar with my other Persona sociocultural analyses series. The Asian financial crisis of 1997 only exacerbated the financial woes of Japan at the time, which all greatly contributed to the eventual need for the Great Heisei mergers, with Heisei referring to the emperor of the time. In case you don't know, Japan still self-distinguishes their eras of history by the current seated emperor. So, during this massive consolidation of rural localities, the number of towns in Japan decreased by a whopping 50%. 1,990 to just 846, while the number of cities increased from 671 to 777 because of all the merging. This fact just further highlights the reality of Japan moving from a more rural to an urbanized society, a major factor of Persona 4's backdrop, right? I think this graph in particular captures how quickly things changed. Just look at the number of rural villages and towns that got gobbled up like this within the span of just 5 years. Like, maybe this isn't the loveliest example perspective, but a comparison to think about is that the same amount of time has passed between this video's release and when the first major pandemic lockdowns began. Kinda crazy to think about, huh? But yeah, anyways, since a lot of these towns became largely tourist dependent, that's a clear problem when the economy is tough and people don't have money to engage in leisure activities. Many of the younger generation had also left to find work in the bigger city hubs, meaning these towns faced huge taxation troubles, which greatly necessitated the Heisei mergers of these towns for fiscal reasons. What's also crazy to think about is that this game released just months before the 2008 recession too. And technically it didn't really impact employment rates in Japan, which were already struggling though for a long time, to be fair. However, it's not hard to see that people were going to be spending way less on non-essentials, meaning less tourism again, which is what so many of the local businesses that party members like Yukiko, Kanji, and Rizei's grandma rely on in Persona 4. Weird transition, but something particularly interesting about these mergers to me is that just because the resulting cities qualify as such based on their newfound size, it doesn't necessarily mean they are one in a landscape or setting. At least not in the way we tend to automatically picture a more industrialized urban environment when we hear the word city. But this is how we get the unique charm of Inaba having this beautiful natural backdrop while still having amenities like the huge Junez shopping mall moving into town. Speaking of Junez, that leads me to the topic of the Shoutengai, a type of business district that used to be the norm in Japan until the 1990s brought along the deregulation of building spaces. These Shoutengai can range in how they look, but overall they're a strip of local shops with the majority of retailers specializing in a single product: fruits, vegetables, meats, books, clothing, as well as places like the drugstore, like sounds pretty familiar, right? They also tend to be closed to car traffic, so Inaba might not fit so well in that regard, perhaps. Though I personally get the impression that it's mostly only delivery vehicles like Namatame's truck that are allowed through the shopping district's road. But I don't know, what do you guys think? Let me know in the comments. Anyway, another thing about Shoutengai is that many were historically developed on roads leading to large shrines or temples. So overall, it just feels like the smaller community business feel is captured so well in Persona 4. And that brings me to Junez. So Junez is modeled after a real-life AEON market/mall in Fuefuki, and AEON Market gained huge expansion and popularity in the late 90s and early 2000s and has now even expanded all throughout Asia. It does tend to bring in more jobs than it shutters, allegedly, in many of these rural areas, and it also serves as a vital community center for all ages, families, and so on. It's described as convenient because you can do all-in-one shopping, grab food, and meet up with friends all in an air-conditioned and/or heated space. Something increasingly important as the climate continues to become more extreme due to climate change. And of course, the affordability in difficult economic times is appreciated as well. Adachi, with his added context from P4 Golden, is a pretty clear example of how people rely on affordable prices for groceries. I mean, pretty much all of us can relate to this with all the price gouging these past couple years, right? However, before you get the impression that I'm a pure Junez / big box store apologist, let me state very clearly that this convenience does come at the expense of the mom and pop stores. It's definitely worrisome how quickly these companies monopolize the entire marketplace, and now even in the internet space by all the tech giants all these years later. Being forced out of business is a devastating reality for many families in Inaba, something particularly explored in Naoki Konishi's social link, right? The benefit of the Shoutengai is that the business owners here also own the actual land they sell from, meaning they don't have to worry about leasing a space from a landlord or development firm, giving these local shopping districts more freedom to relate to and serve the social needs of the community in their own distinct ways instead of focusing on solely economic utility. So, in other words, the closure of these Shoutengai family-owned businesses that have been around for decades, if not centuries, in their respective towns led to a slow erosion of what made these rural municipalities unique. Again, I'm sure many of you from around the world are thinking that this outcome isn't unique to Japan, and that's true. So, something I don't always clarify in my videos is my view that though certain phenomena or outcomes look similar on the surface around the world, the circumstances for these things are nuanced and unique in their own ways to each respective country. But to return to the topic of losing character, it feels like an especially hot button topic right now, right? Globalization just speeding up over the past couple decades is definitely a major factor, and it just feels like ever since the start of this decade, I can't help but notice all these videos, articles, and commentary on how everything looks the same now, especially from all the corporate monopolistic giants. But interestingly enough, it's also kind of cool to see this renewed / resurgent demand from small creators and, independent indie creators again. Anyway, sorry, I know I'm tangenting again, so to get back to the Great Heisei Consolidation from the 2000s, the fact that these small towns had to give up a part of their individual identity and join up with others to survive in this modern age just definitely has an aspect of tragedy for the real-life Inaba, given how Fuefuki went through exactly that. Yeah, in my view, it adds to that conflict between the old Japanese way of life and having to adapt to the times. Persona 4 ends with the cast defeating Izanami, who can be viewed as the mother and stand-in for the old world of Japan. Sure, the game ends on a high note for the cast and the townspeople, but at the same time, it doesn't eliminate the struggle that a family like the Konishis will have trying to keep their business afloat, when it's become so much easier for the townspeople to just go to Junez, especially if there's less and less reason to go to the shopping district as shops close one by one. Through this lens, Yomotsu Hirasaka feels like an even more fitting final dungeon than it already is, with the super old Shinto shrines. Again, via this lens, I think the fog can be additionally interpreted as the town's denial to the changes Japan has seen in such rapid succession since the 90s. If the party isn't able to stop the fog, it would have kept the town of Inaba in a stasis world, cut off from the rest of society. So while the cast refuses to ditch their fondness for their rural way of life entirely, they are much like all other young people of their time, adopting/adapting to modern sensibilities like their cell phones and the fact that their hangouts and literal hideout is all at Junez. It's just about embracing the complexities and contradictions of modern life, I guess. Like a rural setting, but with urban industrialized amenities balanced together, right? So yeah, the fog does lift, and with it, Izanami and the ancient idea of leaving the town's fate to some kind of ancient concept of God or the gods in general. So even though the real-life localities making up Fuefuki likely died in some aspects, it doesn't mean they all just ceased to exist entirely. Everything just evolved. Similarly, I think the entire decline of the shopping district in Persona 4 looks inevitable, and it's true that the businesses negotiated a deal with Junez in the epilogue. Yet, I don't think this means they have to completely give up or give in. They can continue to put their passion, their heart, into the local goods they sell, and who knows, maybe they'll have enough publicity or sales there to continue their main location at the Shoutengai more easily. Ultimately, though, one of the biggest takeaways is that time in life moves on. Yosuke follows up with, "No one wants to be the guy who keeps talking about back in my day." So yeah, the people of these current mergers and or former rural towns can still teach the children and future generations left the joys of nature and the history of their town while still doing what they need to survive and get by for the time being. And if you're curious about other things having to do with Inaba's rapid modernization and or small local vibe, you can check out my videos on Persona 4's obsession with meat or the local idol section of my Rize analysis. Also, please like, share, and or subscribe. And finally, I'd like to thank all my patrons and channel members, especially my Special Fusion supporters: Big Clingy, Sam Bezjak, Francesco Santoyo Rego, M. Meownalin, Malcolm Lowry, Peter Shepard, Andy, Undercloak421, Jimmy Tapiz, Frank Sasaki, and Phoenix Black.